Today we will learn and reflect on critical race theory and how this is reflected in two books associated with the controversy, the 1619 Project book and also the controversial book by the American author Toni Morrison, Beloved. Both concern parents and activists who have no children and have been flooding school board meetings across the country, yelling and threatening each other over critical race theory. And the main question is, should we be teaching our children American history, starting with our founding fathers and the American Revolution when we won our liberty from the British in 1776? Or should we teach our children that our country was originally built on the unpaid labor and bones of slaves, since the first slaves were shipped over in 1619 with the first colonists? One of my projects for this channel is to educate my fellow white Christians on why a proper understanding of civil rights is so critical to truly loving our black neighbors, that black lives really do matter, and how Black Lives Matter is more a concept and not some powerful, shadowy communist movement. And at the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. Many white protesters at school board meetings really have a poor sense of American history in general and civil rights history in particular, mainly because schools have only started teaching this history long after the civil rights struggles in the 60s. And this is a continuation of another video on suggestions on how teachers can teach both sides of critical race theory. And some of the topics discussed in this first video was the academic and the popular definitions of critical race theory, the lost cause and the Dunning School of Interpretation, and how children were taught the history of the lost cause in the Dunning School of Interpretation of the Civil War and Reconstruction, racist tropes that were common back in the day, slavery in the ancient and modern worlds, Civil War history and Black Reconstruction, and history of the Jim Crow, KKK, and Redemptionist era, and a discussion of the approaches of Booker T. Washington versus W.E.B. Du Bois, and a discussion of American evangelicals and civil rights. Now, how did slavery start in 1619? With pirates. And pirates always play a big part in the history of slavery back to ancient times. Pirates often raided coastal areas to enslave their victims. And in 1619, pirates stole several dozen slaves from a slaver ship and resold them to the colonists in Jamestown. So that is how slavery got started. And so at this point, let's step back and get a broad brush view of American history, as many historians view the 1830s, and not 1619, and not 1776, as the key period in American history that truly started the long drive towards civil rights for blacks, starting with the abolition of slavery, and then the emancipation of slaves at the end of the Civil War, and the granting and restoration of civil rights in America, a struggle that's ongoing. And in 1619 through 1776, during the period of colonization, at first, mostly indentured servants were brought over to the colonies, and after a period of service, they would become free men. But this was replaced by slaves on the large southern plantations, mainly because working on cotton plantations and rice plantations was miserable work. And it was just difficult sometimes to get indentured servants to do that kind of work. We have 1787 and the drafting of the Constitution and the compromises of the Constitutional Convention. International slave trade was abolished in 1808, and slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person. There was a fugitive slave laws where Southerners were guaranteed the right to recapture fugitive slaves in the northern states. And these clauses were agreed to because the Founding Fathers thought that slavery would soon wither away. But in 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which automated picking the seeds out of the cotton, a very labor-intensive task. But this helped rejuvenate the slave economy because then there was impetus to put more slaves to work picking the cotton. And in the 1830s, abolitionists agitate for the end of slavery in England and also in the U.S. In the 1850s, the free labor movement sought to abolish the unfair competition between free white yeomen and slaves in the territories, particularly those territories where large-scale plantations were simply impractical. In 1861 to 65, of course, the Civil War, black runaway slaves were a key factor in the Northern victory in the Civil War. And the decades after the war was the presidential and radical Reconstruction. After that, we have the redemptionist or Jim Crow era of discrimination, where the civil rights gains of the Reconstruction era were rolled back. And 1900s, the invention of the mechanical harvester. And this lessened the need for slave labor for things like harvesting cotton. And in 1965, we have the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and this was the second civil rights movement, picking up where Reconstruction had left off. Now, the first book we're going to review here is Beloved by Toni Morrison. Now, during our discussion group, I pointed out my opinion that Beloved would likely turn off old white Christian men like me, and that wasn't helpful. And one of the black ladies in the group mentioned that Toni Morrison was mainly speaking to other black women, helping them to deal with the psychological struggles and understanding their past and coping with trying to thrive and survive in a country where many whites were just not sympathetic with the Black Lives Matter movement. And again, notice, this is much more of a movement than an organization, and Black Lives Matter is not synonymous with communism, and indeed that assertion is slanderous and is a bald-faced lie. Now, Toni Morrison was born in 1931, and the math states that in her 20s she lived during the Jim Crow era, which is a dark time for blacks to live, and her negative personal experiences living under Jim Crow affected the message she would tell. And let us read the opening sentences of Beloved, and keep in mind the intended audiences of the black women. 124 was spiteful, full of a baby's venom. The women in the hour knew it, and so did the children. For years each put up with the spite in his own way, but by 1873, Sethi and her daughter Denver were its only victims. The grandmother, Baby Suggs, her name for a grandmother, was dead, and the sons, Howard and Bugler, had run away by the time they were 13 years old. As soon as merely looking in a mirror shattered it, and that was the signal for Bugler. As soon as 2 tiny handprints appeared in the cake, that was it for Howard. Neither boy wanted to see more. Another kettle full of chickpeas smoking in a heap on the floor, and soda crackers crumbled and strewn in a line next to the doorway. And these traumatic ramblings go on for much of the book. After the first chapter, I was able to pick up some clues on what was happening, but after a few dozen pages, I was forced to ask Dr. Wikipedia for a synopsis. Now, in my humble opinion, books should really be written so you can read them without asking for help from Dr. Wikipedia or an English teacher looking over your shoulder telling you what you should think about the book. Now, Beloved is a book for woke English teachers in my humble opinion. Now, I define woke here as an English teacher who forces her students to read Lord of the Flies every year so she doesn't have to read any new books herself. Now, Dr. Wikipedia also says that there are other people who don't like the book, and the other books in the trilogy read much the same way. So says Dr. Wikipedia. So we will allow Dr. Wikipedia to summarize the plot. Beloved is inspired by an event that actually happened. A slave escaped and fled to the Free State of Ohio in 1856. She was subject to recapture under the provisions of the Fugitive Slave Law. When U.S. Marshals burst into the cabin where Gardner and her husbands had barricaded themselves, she was attempting to kill her children, and had already killed her 2-year-old daughter to spare them from being returned to slavery. Now, we know the reason for these traumatic ramblings. Her life experiences are so devastating that this ex-slave mother exists in a state of perpetual mental breakdown, like she's psychotic or something. And by the way, there's precedent for this action. Soon after the time of Christ, the Jews revolted against the Romans. Their last redoubt was the fortress Herod built in the desert, Masada. And as you recall, the Romans built massive siege works that exist up to the present day to storm the citadel, and it was common practice in the ancient world, when you captured a hostile enemy city, to massacre the men and enslave the women and children, and they could select concubines from among the women and girls. To save their family from slavery under pagan masters, the Jewish defenders at Masada first slew their women and children, and then all the men committed suicide. And this was exactly the sin that the lady in Beloved committed. And the plot summary from Dr. Wikipedia. Beloved begins in 1873 with Sethi, formerly enslaved women, and her 18-year-old daughter, Denver, who live at 124 Bluestone Road. But now we know what 124 means. The site has been haunted by many years by what they believe is the ghost of Sethi's oldest daughter. And Sethi's sons, Howard and Bugler, had run away from home by the age of 13 due to the ghost. And one day, Paul D., one of the enslaved men from the Sweet Home, which is the plantation where Sethi, Hallie, Baby Suggs, and several others were once enslaved, arrives at Sethi's home. He forces out the spirit and persuades them to leave the house for the first time in years for a carnival. On returning home, they find a young woman sitting in front of the house who calls herself Beloved, and Beloved appears to be the ghost of the baby who was killed. One of my problems with Beloved is that it actually understates the brutality of slavery. And Beloved is also an extreme example of the Kramer problem. If you remember, Kramer lived in the same apartment as Jerry Seinfeld. Kramer never worked, evidently was not living off an inheritance, and his only life skill was his dramatic entrances into Jerry's apartment. Like, how could Kramer afford to pay the rent on a New York City apartment? Now, after the Civil War, our ex-slave mother Sethi and her large family lived in this apparently large house in Ohio. But she doesn't have a job. How does she make rent? Somehow she's living in the same haunted house. She's too traumatized to make rent, but her family is left alone. How can that be? Now, reality would be even more cruel than the book. Her baby was not her baby. Her baby belonged to her master. Her baby was her master's property. And when she killed that baby, she was destroying her master's property. And when she was returned to her master, she would have been severely beaten, and probably beaten to death. In general, when people are down, they're not left alone. They are continuously hounded until they are utterly and completely ruined. Because life is cruel. Plot summary continued. Paul D. begins to feel increasingly uncomfortable in the house, and that he's being driven out. Paul D. begins to feel increasingly uncomfortable, and one night Paul D. is cornered by Beloved, who demands sex. While they have sex, his mind is filled with horrific memories from the past. Paul D. tries to tell Sethi about it, but cannot. And instead, he wants her pregnant, etc., etc. It goes on. Now, I totally get why sex is so casual. Slavery robbed women of their agency, their privacy, their free will. And if the master wanted to force himself on a slave, she was his property. He could do with her as she wished. And I want to point out that sexual assault in concubines is a problem of all systems of slavery in both the ancient and the modern worlds. And we have a video that explores this concept, how the Iliad itself was about the trading of concubines between men, where the women could never just say no, and how the Old Testament laws exhorted Jewish soldiers to treat their concubines, captured in war, with kindness, as they are truly their Jewish wives. The author's really expressing how the morals of slaves who are treated like breeding livestock can be debased. But many white Christians trying to read this book, who are not black, who are not in tune with the ugly history of slavery, they're just going to be offended by the casual sex, and this detracts totally from the main message. And finally, we have the odd plot line of casting this as a ghost story, where the soul of a murdered infant slave girl is resurrected in a mysterious character in the book. This is also not a Christian theme, and it also detracts from the main message. And also, Beloved is a despairing novel, though the characters in the story do reconcile themselves somewhat to their fate. Now, much more inspiring to me are the slave biographies we have reviewed, and you may object that these are the small minorities of ex-slaves who are able to rise above their condition. Beloved, in contrast, is about the bottom tenth of slaves who are eternally traumatized by the years they spent in slavery. However, inspiring stories do inspire all of us to improve our lives, but despairing stories, well, they're just despairing, they're just depressing. And so the final question is, should Beloved be banned from the school libraries? Absolutely not. Children watch movies much worse than this, and if you ban this book, the right-wing nuts will want to ban every other book that conflicts with the lost cause narrative. However, I do not see how this book, Beloved, will influence any white readers to greater compassion for their black neighbors. In my humble opinion, the slave autobiography of Frederick Douglass would compel greater compassion, and these are some slides from this video. Frederick Douglass tells us, "My father was a white man. The opinion was whispered that my master was my father, but of the correctness of the opinion I know nothing. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant, before I even knew her as my mother. Now, it's common custom in Maryland to part children from their mothers at an early age. Often these involuntary orphans would be raised by an old slave woman too old for field labor. These slave owners would be as quick to separate slave children from their parents as people give away puppies from their pet dog's litter. Many masters bred slaves just like they bred cows or horses. They paired their slaves up, often forcing them to breed. Young slaves from coastal plantations were often sold to the more prosperous black belt plantations in the Deep South, such as Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, breaking up many slave families. Frederick notes that when the master caters to his own lusts, this makes gratification of their wicked desires profitable as well as pleasurable, for by this cunning engagement the slaveholder, in cases not a few, sustains to his slaves the double relation of master and father, and these slave concubines were often a constant offense to their mistress. She likes to see them suffer under the lash and often sells them off to be rid of them. Frederick Douglass also remembers, "I have said that my master found religious sanction for his cruelty. In one example, I've seen him tie up this lame young woman and whip her with a heavy cowskin upon her naked shoulders, causing the warm red blood to drip. And in justification of this bloody deed, he will quote this passage from Scripture: 'He that knoweth his master's will, and doeth it not, shall be beaten with many stripes.'" And we have another interesting video of a former illiterate slave, Fatherlton, who was the first former slave to be ordained a priest. He was totally illiterate when his family escaped to freedom during the Civil War, but he became literate not only in English but also German, Latin, and Greek, and attended seminary in Rome. Unlike Beloved, the 1619 Project book should increase the compassion of any white person who reads it with an open mind. In my humble opinion, the subtitle of the book should rather read Ordinary Lives of Black People in America for the Last 100 Years. And we will review the chapter in the 1619 Project titled Inheritance that has some remarkable stories about the persecutions and assassinations of ordinary blacks who tried to be successful and too uppity in the Deep South not so long ago in the post-World War II era of prosperity. And unlike Beloved, it also shows how blacks were kicked when they were down with even greater cruelty. If you are white, the next time you are tempted to accuse blacks of being shiftless or lazy or unenterprising, these stories should give you pause, as they reveal what happened to blacks who were too successful and too uppity in the Deep South. And this is the story of Elmore Bowling in a small town in Alabama. Elmore had a large family, 7 children who helped in the family business with a large house, a general store, a delivery service, a catering company, and a gas station. At his peak, Elmore employed as many as 40 people, all black like him. He likely had some $40,000 in savings. His total assets in today's dollars may have been $500,000. This is mostly money that he earned. Elmore only rented his property, he never owned it, and this was because his father and grandfather had owned a farm on which they ran cattle. After they had become successful, a white neighbor claimed the land was his and just stole it from them, for blacks had no access to the legal system whatsoever in the state of Alabama. But it was the expansion of this little general store that changed his fortunes. Elmore and his wife Bertha had started doing Friday night fish fries, serving Sunday dinners, and selling ice cream to the after-church crowd, which was a delicacy where most people didn't have electricity. They grew their business by adding a one-pump gas station out front. Elmore got the idea to sell gas after a white-owned station nearby refused to serve him. At the Bowling's pump, black drivers could have a safe, reliable place to fill up. Not long after, the Bowlings and every black man, woman, and children in the county would learn the cost of daring to be successful and too free. On a mild December day in 1947, a deputy sheriff came to Elmore's store while his 12-year-old son, Willie D, was working and asked where his father was. His father was running errands, and when he returned to the store, some cars were following him. As Elmore got out of his truck, 2 white men confronted him. It seemed that in buying a pump and selling gas, Elmore had stepped over some invisible line. Gunfire ran out. The white men shot Elmore 7 times. His wife and his children heard the terrifying sounds and rushed from the store to find their father lying dead in a ditch. Now, why would these white men be so brazen to murder a black man in broad daylight, making no effort to conceal their identities in front of his wife and children? The deputy sheriff was involved. There was no justice for blacks in Jim Crow Alabama. When blacks called in crimes, often they, the victim, were arrested for causing trouble. Plus, in the Deep South during slavery, blacks were seen as subhuman, like talking livestock. I mean, you would think nothing of butchering a cow in the sight of his cat, so many white people would reason, why would this matter for blacks? And this is not a unique story. The first lynching documented by the incredibly brave black journalist Ida B. Wells was a lynching of a black store owner who dared to compete with a white store owner. The accusation was that he molested some white women. That was usually the accusation. When there was an accusation, but success in competing against white people was the real reason why he was seen as being way too uppity and in need of lynching. Unlike the blacks in Beloved, now the whites persecuted the members of the black family even more intensely after the murder of Elmore. The youngest daughter of Josephine remembers, within a year of Elmore Bowling's murder, nearly all of the family's wealth was gone. White creditors and whites posing as creditors took the money the family made from the sale of their trucks and cattle. Other whites simply claimed they were owed money. Bertha May feared what would happen if she didn't pay them. The family lost everything. They lost their inheritance. They lost their home. They were later forced to flee the county in the dark of night to save their own skins. The youngest daughter, Josephine, remembers, my father's murder actually killed aspirations for black people. Everyone had to go back working for plantation owners. No one wanted to take over the business. Not his brothers. One brother said of the business, no, this is what got Elmore killed. Young Josephine was the least traumatized because she was so young. She was the only child who attended college, and she became a teacher. This was one of the few safe occupations open to blacks in those days. Even though Elmore had encouraged all his children to get an education, all the other children eventually dropped out of school, taking safe, unsuccessful, menial jobs just to eke out a living. Josephine tells a sad tale of how this traumatic afternoon ruined the lives of several generations by telling their sad tale of woes faced by many black families. Money problems, marital problems, drinking problems, mental health problems, which landed Willie D., the son who helped his father and watched him die in the ditch, in a psychiatric facility. Those suppressed memories Willie D. locked up in his soul bubbled up when talking to his sister Josephine one day. He remembered the white men who came to the store looking for his father, the terror he felt, the sounds of gunfire, his father's dead body. He even tried to peel the boots off his father's feet because he would not be able to go to heaven with his boots on. There is an even worse story in this chapter about a prosperous black farmer who was getting too damned prosperous and bigoty for a nigger. And this is the story of how the problem of black prosperity was dealt with. A black man had the temerity to become a successful farmer on a 140-acre farm. Days later, when the black man and 4 of his children went into town, a marshal served him a warrant for trespassing. The marshal then attacked the black man, pistol whipping him to the ground. A group of white men jumped in and began to choke and beat him. As his daughters rushed to help their father, the man kicked one of them in the gut. The family was overpowered by the mob and dragged to jail. 3 of the man's daughters were charged with resisting arrest, and his son was falsely accused of carrying a pistol. That night, the mob shot up his house, waking his wife and his other children. In the next few days, their stolen crops were sold underneath them. The family had to flee. They never returned, because they'd been warned that if they had returned, they would be lynched. The father was sentenced to 12 months' labor on a chain gang and was fined $250. The daughters were fined $50 each, and the son was fined $100. Now, since many of my friends and family live in Florida, I just want to mention there was a riot where whites burned down the Negro homes and businesses in Rosewood, Florida in 1923, and all the town blacks had to flee with only the clothes on their backs, with no justice served and no financial recompense for the homes and property they lost. Now we'll talk about the sources we used for this video. One primary source is this newly published edition of the 1619 Project, and you can tell from the chapter titles that each chapter covers a different topic. It reminds me of the ordinary lives in the ancient world books that I've read before. As is this, you see chapters on citizenship, medicine, traffic, church, justice, music, inheritance, healthcare, and a lot of other chapters. And here's Toni Morrison's Beloved, and I might add that part of my dislike for the book is the same reason that I couldn't watch Clint Eastwood's movies on the lady prizefighter, $1 Million Baby. Reading a book that is primarily about personal trauma is just something I do not enjoy. And this is the painting we used in our thumbnail for this video. The YouTube description links to the video script and our blog. Please support our channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons, and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. And please click on the links for interesting videos on other topics that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.